It was a cold November evening in Pittsburgh, and I was just settling into my old recliner after dinner. The smell of roasted chicken still lingered in the kitchen, and the sound of the Steelers game hummed softly from the TV. Carolyn was upstairs helping Sophia with her math homework, while Jason kicked a ball around in the backyard, his laughter echoing through the window. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. A simple life. A steady job in construction, a wife who still looked at me with love after all these years, 2 kids who thought I could fix anything in the world. I remember holding my coffee mug, steam fogging my glasses, when a knock thundered against the front door. Not a neighborly knock. Not the kind you expect from a friend. This one rattled the glass, sharp and urgent. My heart stuttered. Before I could rise, Jason peeked in, wide-eyed, whispering, "Dad, there are cops outside." I opened the door and the night exploded into red and blue lights. Detective Raymond Briggs stood there, face like stone, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Anthony Walker, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Price." The words didn't make sense. Murder, Price? My knees nearly buckled. Behind them, neighbors were gathering, their silhouettes forming shadows against the flashing lights. Carolyn rushed down the stairs, her voice breaking into panic. "There's been a mistake." But the cold steel of handcuffs clamped around my wrists before I could say a word. The cuffs bit into my skin, and in that instant the air seemed to vanish. I wasn't a husband, a father, or a worker anymore. I was a criminal in their eyes. And the world, my world, ended on that doorstep. The ride in the squad car was a blur of neon and concrete. I pressed my forehead against the cold window, trying to breathe, trying to understand. Murder. I barely knew Daniel Price, a man I had only seen a handful of times on construction sites. I didn't even know he had been killed. My thoughts twisted, colliding with Carolyn's voice, fading behind me. "Tony, tell them the truth, Tony." But the car sped away, swallowing her words in sirens. At the station, the smell of bleach and stale cigarettes clung to the walls. Briggs shoved me into an interrogation room, a square box with buzzing fluorescent lights that drilled into my skull. He sat across from me, his fingers tapping the table. "You were seen leaving the alley where Price was shot. Witnesses place you there." His tone wasn't asking, it was accusing, like the verdict had already been read. I tried to explain I had been home eating dinner with my family, but every word I spoke bounced off him like rain on glass. He leaned in close, his breath of coffee and cigarettes sour. "You're not walking out of here, Walker. Might as well come clean." I shook my head, sweat rolling down my back, fear crawling under my skin. The clock on the wall ticked louder, mocking me. Hours passed, questions twisted, accusations piled. My voice cracked with desperation. "I didn't kill him. I wasn't there." Briggs just smirked, his eyes narrowing. And then, in a low voice, he said words that chilled me more than the cuffs had. "Juries love a family man who snaps." Easy story. Easy conviction. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about truth. This was about a story they wanted to tell, and I was the villain in it. By midnight, they finally dragged me to a holding cell. The iron door slammed shut behind me, the clang echoing through my chest. The stench of sweat and urine hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic taste of fear on my tongue. I sat on the hard bench, hands trembling, staring at the graffiti carved into the wall. Names, dates, curses, like ghosts of men who had sat where I now sat, swallowed by the same system. I thought of Carolyn tucking Sophia into bed without me, of Jason pressing his face against the window looking for my return. Would they believe me? Would they hold on? Or would this single night stain me forever? Every sound outside, keys rattling, footsteps echoing, someone yelling down the corridor, hammered into me that I didn't belong here. Yet here I was. I closed my eyes, trying to pray, but the words stuck in my throat. I kept hearing Briggs's voice, easy story. Easy conviction. It was like a curse. I told myself the truth would set me free, that no jury could believe I had done this. But deep down, a cold dread spread through me. What if the truth didn't matter? What if my life had been stolen before I even knew I was losing it? The cell felt smaller, the night darker. And as I lay down on the steel cot, the final thought that cut through me was this. The knock on my door wasn't just the end of my day. It was the end of my freedom, and maybe the end of my life as I knew it. Before the knock, before the sirens and the handcuffs, I was just Tony Walker, a man with calloused hands and a back that ached from honest work. Construction wasn't glamorous, but it put food on the table. I can still smell the dust of fresh cement, still feel the grit under my nails when I came home each night. Carolyn would tease me about tracking mud into the kitchen, but she'd smile as she said it, and that smile was everything. Saturdays were for fixing up the house, painting walls, patching roofs. Sundays I grilled burgers, while Jason and Sophia ran circles around the yard, their laughter like music. Life wasn't easy. We lived paycheck to paycheck, but it was ours, and I wore my pride in that like a badge. I never imagined that being ordinary would someday be used against me. I remember the mornings most. Jason's school bus squealing to a stop, Sophia waving her backpack at me, Carolyn's coffee steaming on the counter. Those little rituals, the hum of a family's rhythm, were the heartbeat of my world. I never thought to cherish them like final moments, and maybe that's what stings most now, how normal life was before it was snatched away. That was the man I used to be, simple, steady, content. And that man was about to be buried alive by a system that didn't care who he really was. I had known Daniel Price only in passing. He was a subcontractor, sometimes around the job sites, always with a quick joke or a pack of cigarettes in his shirt pocket. We weren't friends. We weren't enemies. We were barely acquaintances. Yet somehow his death became the cross I was forced to carry. When Briggs later painted me as a jealous rival, a man who snapped under pressure, I wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. Pressure? My pressure was bills, a leaky roof, maybe an overdue electric bill. Not murder. Never murder. But they didn't want to hear that. They didn't want the real Anthony Walker. They wanted a story, a villain that fit the headline. My friends from work, guys like Kenny and Luis, stood by me at first. No way Tony did this, they told reporters. But rumors are like wildfire. By the end of the first week, whispers had twisted into suspicion. Neighbors who once waved across their porches now turned away when Carolyn walked by. Even Jason's teacher pulled him aside, asking careful questions, as if guilt could be passed down like blood. That's when I realized innocence isn't enough when the world has already decided who you are. At night, in those first days before the trial, I would lie awake in the county jail and replay my life like an old film reel. I saw myself teaching Jason to ride a bike on our cracked driveway, his knees bloody from falls, but his grin wide when he finally found his balance. I saw Sophia's tiny hands clutching her first doll, her eyes bright as she whispered, "Daddy, fix it," every time the arm came loose. And I saw Carolyn, younger then, laughing under the cheap fairy lights we strung up on the back porch when we first moved in. We had nothing but dreams, and yet those dreams felt like riches. I clung to those memories like a lifeline. They reminded me of who I really was when everything else tried to strip me bare. I wasn't a killer. I wasn't some monster Briggs painted me to be. I was a husband, a father, a man who worked too many hours and worried about grocery bills. And yet the walls around me whispered otherwise. The guards looked at me like I was already guilty. The other inmates asked me what I did, their smirks daring me to prove I didn't belong. I tried to hold on to my past, to keep the man I used to be alive inside me, but each day chipped away at him, until even I wondered how long I could keep believing in him myself. The news of Daniel Price's murder spread through Pittsburgh like fire through dry grass. I didn't even know he was dead until I heard the whispers in county jail. They said he'd been shot in a back alley late at night. No clean fingerprints, no clear suspects. But within 24 hours, my name became the headline. Construction worker suspected in brutal killing. My face, the same face that smiled at barbecues and cheered at Little League games, was printed beneath the word murder. Seeing it was like being erased and rewritten into someone else's story. I wanted to rip the paper apart, scream until the walls shook, but in here my voice was just another echo lost in the dark. Once the world believes you're guilty, it doesn't matter how loud you shout. You're nothing but the monster they've painted you to be. Detective Briggs didn't waste a second building his narrative. He claimed Daniel and I argued over a contract on a job site, that tempers flared, and I stalked him into that alley. He produced a witness, Eric Johnson, a jittery young man who sometimes lingered near our sites looking for odd jobs. I barely knew him, but under pressure he swore he'd seen me pull the trigger. I could see Briggs's fingerprints all over that testimony. Eric wasn't strong. He was a kid pushed into a corner, and he folded. His words became chains around my wrists. And the worst part, No one questioned why his story shifted every time he told it. No one wanted to. The prosecution polished every scrap of my life into evidence of a hidden rage. They called neighbors to the stand who recalled hearing me raise my voice at my kids, Carolyn crying once after an argument, my fist pounding a wall after a long day. Ordinary struggles twisted into proof of a violent nature. They called me unstable, dangerous, a family man who had finally snapped. The jury sat there listening, wide-eyed, as though I were some beast waiting to break free. I wanted to stand up, to shout that I had never lifted a hand to Carolyn, never once thought of hurting another man. But my lawyer, Peter Lawson, just patted my arm, whispering, "Trust the process." His voice was flat, tired. And that's when I realized he didn't believe I had a chance either. Every time the prosecutor spoke, it felt like pieces of me were being cut away. I sat there in my cheap suit, trying to hold on to the man I used to be, but with each accusation, I felt him slipping. Briggs smirked from the back of the courtroom, like he had already won. The witnesses piled up, their stories overlapping just enough to weave a rope strong enough to hang me. And through it all, Carolyn sat in the front row, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't give. Jason and Sophia weren't there. Thank God for that. They didn't need to see their father turned into a stranger before their very eyes. What hurt most wasn't the prosecutor's words, or Briggs's lies, or Lawson's silence. It was how quickly the people around me began to believe it. Friends who had once shared beers with me after long shifts suddenly kept their distance. Kenny and Louise swore to reporters in the beginning, Tony couldn't have done this. But the weeks dragged on and their voices faded. Neighbors who once waved from their porches now turned away when Carolyn walked by. Even Jason's teacher pulled him aside, gently asking if his father ever got angry at home. Guilt, it seemed, was contagious, and I had infected everyone I loved. Letters from Sophia slowed, her childish drawings of suns and stick figures replaced by silence. Jason barely spoke on the phone, his voice hollow, waiting for me to sound like the father he remembered. And Carolyn. Her calls grew shorter, her tone heavier, like doubt had slipped into her chest and wouldn't let go. I wanted to tell them to believe me, to hold on, but every word I said felt weaker than the one before. Each night in my cell I felt the weight of a crime I hadn't committed pressed down harder, crushing me. And I knew the trial was coming fast, the place where truth was supposed to matter most. But deep down I already feared it wouldn't matter at all. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood and old paper, a place where silence was heavy, but judgment came sharp. I sat at the defense table, my cheap tie choking me tighter than the cuffs ever had. Judge Robert Whitman presided from his high bench, his face carved from stone, eyes distant as if my life were just another case file stacked on his desk. When the trial opened, the prosecution moved like a machine. District Attorney Martin Keene stood tall, his voice crisp and confident, as though he were narrating a play. Every word dripped with certainty. I was a violent man, jealous of Daniel Price, consumed by rage. He painted me with broad strokes, turning a hard-working father into a villain, and the jury leaned in like children hearing a bedtime story. Except this story was written in blood that wasn't mine. Briggs took the stand early, speaking with the authority of the badge on his chest. He told the jury I had motive, that Price and I clashed over work contracts, that men had seen me arguing in bars. Lies slid from his mouth like oil, slick and poisonous. My lawyer, Peter Lawson, barely pushed back, fumbling through his notes, his questions soft as whispers. "Detective, are you certain?" he asked, and Briggs smirked. 100%. His certainty filled the room like smoke, and I could see jurors nodding. My pulse hammered. I wanted to leap up, to scream that this was all wrong, but the system doesn't give men like me a voice. It hands us a script, and mine was written in guilt. The so-called star witness was Eric Johnson. I'll never forget the way he looked when he walked in, head down, shoulders hunched, hands twitching. A boy, really, dragged into a game he didn't understand. He claimed he saw me in the alley, a gun in my hand, smoke still rising. His voice cracked on every sentence, eyes darting to Briggs as if seeking approval. I wanted to call out, to remind him of the truth, that he'd never been there, that this story had been fed to him like poison. But my attorney didn't tear into him, didn't press the cracks, just a few polite questions before letting him step down. I watched Eric's shoulders sag with relief, and I knew then, His lie had been cemented in the minds of the jury. His word, however shaky, was worth more than mine. The prosecution marched on. Neighbors described me as short-tempered. A former co-worker claimed I'd once threatened to punch Daniel over a late payment, though I remembered it as nothing more than a heated exchange. Carolyn was called too, my wife, my anchor. She sat there trembling, her voice breaking as they twisted her words. They asked if I ever scared her. She paused, too long, and the silence was enough. The jury didn't need her to say yes. They already heard it in the crack of her voice. When she finally left the stand, she wouldn't meet my eyes. That look haunted me more than the shackles ever did. When it was our turn, Lawson stumbled through a defense as thin as paper. He called no strong witnesses, presented no real evidence. He leaned only on my word, as if the truth spilling from my lips would somehow outweigh the polished lies stacked against me. I took the stand, my hands trembling, sweat soaking through my shirt. I told them where I was with Carolyn and the kids at home, carving chicken for dinner. I told them I never hurt Daniel Price, that I barely knew him. My words poured out raw, desperate, but I could feel them falling flat like stones tossed into a bottomless well. The jurors stared back at me with polite blankness, their minds already sealed. Judge Whitman barely glanced up as objections flew, as my pleas tangled in technicalities. His gavel cracked the air whenever Lawson tried to push harder, always in favor of the prosecution. It was clear the scales weren't balanced. They never were, and as the trial wound down, I felt it in my bones. Truth had no seat in this courtroom. It had been locked outside with my freedom. When Keene stood for closing arguments, his voice rang like a sermon. Anthony Walker is a danger to his family, his community, and he must be punished. The jury hung on every word. And me. I sat there silent, my life being buried under lies while the man I used to be faded further into memory. This wasn't justice. This was execution dressed in a suit and tie. The verdict came down like a thunderclap. Guilty. The word rang in my ears long after the gavel fell. Carolyn wept in the front row. Jason hid his face against her side, and Sophia clutched her mother's arm, too young to understand, but old enough to know her father was being taken away. My legs felt hollow as guards gripped my arms and pulled me through a side door. The air in the courthouse hallway was thick with whispers, some pity, most condemnation. By the time I was shoved into the transport van, shackles biting into my ankles, I already felt half dead. The drive to the prison blurred past neon lights and empty streets. My city, my home. Every block we passed was a memory, where Jason learned to ride his bike, where Carolyn and I had our first kiss. But the glass and steel barred me from touching any of it again. When the gates of the prison clanged shut behind us, I knew the world outside had sealed me away. The intake process stripped the last pieces of my dignity. They made me undress under blinding lights, every inch of me searched while officers smirked. The smell of bleach, sweat, and disinfectant burned my nose. They shoved an orange jumpsuit into my hands, thin fabric that felt like paper against my skin. They took my wedding ring, my watch, every piece of the man I had been. By the time I was led down the corridor, my footsteps echoing on concrete, I no longer felt like Anthony Walker. I was just inmate number 47219. The cell door slammed with a metallic thud that rattled my bones. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with mildew and rust. A thin mattress sagged on a steel frame, stained with years of sweat. The toilet in the corner stank of rot. My cellmate, Jerome Red Harris, sat on the bunk opposite, his muscular arms covered in tattoos that crawled up his neck. He looked me over, eyes sharp, then chuckled. "Fresh meat," he muttered, lying back without another word. My throat tightened. I had worked with men my whole life, but nothing prepared me for this. Being caged with strangers, some dangerous, some broken, all forgotten. The sounds of prison never stopped. Keys rattling, doors clanging, men shouting down corridors, the distant thud of fists against flesh. Somewhere a man screamed until his voice broke. I sat on my bunk, trying to steady my breath, my hands shaking as I pressed them against my knees. I thought of Carolyn tucking the kids into bed, the quiet hum of the dishwasher, the warmth of my home. But here there was only concrete and shadows. Red broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "Rule number 1, keep your head down. Don't look for trouble. Trouble will find you anyway." His words were less warning than prophecy, and they sank into me like ice. Sleep was impossible that first night. Every creak of metal made me flinch. Every shout from another cell felt like it was aimed at me. I lay on the cot staring at the cracked ceiling, the stench of rust filling my lungs. My mind replayed the trial. Briggs's lies, Keene's booming voice, Carolyn's tear-streaked face. I told myself it was a nightmare I'd wake from, that the morning light would prove it all false. But when the morning came harsh and grey through the barred window, I was still there. And I realized nightmares don't end when you open your eyes. They only deepen. That morning, a guard named Tommy Blake rattled the bars with his baton, grinning as he shouted, "Rise and shine, killers!" His voice was gleeful, cruel, like he enjoyed reminding us of the labels stamped on our backs. I sat up slowly, my body heavy, my soul heavier. Red looked at me, eyes tired but knowing. "Welcome to hell, Walker," he said. And hell it was. That first night had carved the truth into me. I wasn't just locked away from the world. The world had been locked away from me. And I had no idea if I'd ever see it again. At first, Carolyn visited every week. She brought Jason and Sophia, their small hands pressing against the glass as they smiled at me through tears. I lived for those visits, counting the days, replaying their voices in my head each night. Carolyn always said the same thing, her eyes fierce even when rimmed with exhaustion. "We'll get you out, Tony, we'll find a way." I clung to that promise like a lifeline. But promises bend under the weight of years. The kids grew older, their school schedules busier. Carolyn's voice on the phone sounded thinner, more distant. One day, Jason didn't want to come inside the prison, choosing to wait in the car. Another day, Sophia buried her face in her arms, refusing to look at me. Each visit chipped a piece off my heart until the cracks began to show. Letters became my refuge. Sophia's drawings, stick figures holding hands, suns with wide smiles, covered my cell wall. Jason's notes, scribbled in uneven handwriting, told me about baseball games and report cards. But slowly even those stopped. The envelopes grew fewer, the silence longer. I told myself they were busy, that life outside moved too fast, but in my gut I knew the truth. I was slipping from their world, fading into a ghost they rarely thought about. And Carolyn, her words became shorter, her visits rarer. When she came, her hands trembled as she twisted her wedding band. One afternoon she looked at me with eyes that no longer held fire, only defeat, and whispered, "I can't keep doing this." The day Carolyn stopped wearing her ring was the day I felt my soul break. She told me she met someone, a man who made her feel alive again, a man who wasn't locked behind steel bars. I wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but my voice caught in my throat. What right did I have to hold her prisoner too? She promised she'd always let me see the kids, but even that promise dissolved over time. Phone calls went unanswered. Birthdays passed without a word. I tried writing letters, page after page, pouring out love, regret, hope, but most came back unopened, stamped "Return to Sender." Each returned envelope was a blade, carving deeper into the truth. I was no longer husband or father. I was a memory too painful for them to carry. The night I learned Carolyn had remarried, Red found me sitting on my bunk, a letter crumpled in my fist, my chest heaving. He didn't say much, just sat across from me, his presence heavy but steady. "Hurts like hell," he muttered, his eyes distant. "But it won't kill you." "Don't let it." His words were rough, but I clung to them, because in that moment I felt like I was dying. Not from the prison food or the cold concrete, but from the slow erasure of everything that once made me a man. The losses piled up like bricks on my chest. My mother, Martha, passed away in my 5th year inside. I wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. They gave me 10 minutes in a small chapel with a chaplain, a candle, and a photo of her smiling. I whispered goodbye to the picture, but it felt hollow, cruel. She had raised me, loved me, and I couldn't even stand by her grave. That regret still haunts me. Friends drifted away one by one. Phone numbers changed, letters stopped. I became a man with no one, a ghost breathing inside 4 walls. The only constant was Red, who reminded me I wasn't completely alone. Though even he carried scars too deep to name. Every night, I replayed what I'd lost. Carolyn's laughter, Jason's first home run, Sophia's bedtime giggles, my mother's hugs. They became shadows, unreachable, fading with each passing year. The system hadn't just stolen my freedom. It had stolen my family, my future, my place in the world. And as I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, I realized prison wasn't just about bars and chains. It was about loss. Endless, merciless loss, and I feared there was still so much more left for it to take. Years slid by inside those concrete walls until time itself became a blur. Days bled into nights, seasons into decades. The world outside kept spinning, but for me it stopped the night the verdict came down. Inmates came and went, young men with fire in their eyes, old men broken down by years. But I stayed rooted like a tree no one cared to cut down. Red once told me, "Prison don't kill you quick. It just erases you slow," and that's what it felt like. Erasure. My name faded from the mouths of friends. My face disappeared from family photo albums, and even in my own mind I sometimes struggled to remember the sound of my children's voices. Jason's laugh, Sophia's bedtime whispers, they grew faint like echoes in a tunnel that stretched farther away each year. The routines consumed me. Wake up at dawn to the clang of metal, line up for tasteless food, march to the yard, return to the cell. The monotony was crushing. Men fought just to feel alive, knives fashioned from scraps, blood spilled on concrete, screams echoing down the block. I kept my head low, just like Red told me, but trouble had a way of finding everyone eventually. More than once I found myself pressed against the wall, fists flying, survival boiling down to instinct, and through it all the guards like Tommy Blake laughed, mocking us, reminding us we were less than men. Forgotten by the world, forgotten by justice. Letters had long stopped coming. Birthdays passed like shadows. I'd whisper the dates to myself. Jason's 21 today, or Sophia's graduating high school. But I had no photos, no proof, just guesses. My children became strangers in my imagination, growing older in ways I couldn't picture. Sometimes I closed my eyes and imagined walking into a diner, seeing them as adults not recognizing me at all. That fear gnawed at me more than hunger ever did. My mother's absence burned too. I'd dream of her voice, calling me home for Sunday dinners, only to wake and find myself in that freezing cell, the stench of rust and sweat filling my lungs. I was surrounded by men, yet lonelier than I'd ever been. Red tried to keep me grounded. He'd tell stories from his past, wild nights on the streets of Detroit, women he loved, mistakes he couldn't undo. Sometimes we'd laugh until our sides ached, and for a fleeting moment the bars disappeared. But even he couldn't stop the decay of time. One winter, pneumonia swept through the block. Red coughed until his body shook, and though I begged the guards for help, they ignored him. By the time a medic finally arrived, Red was gone. His absence hollowed me. He had been my anchor, my only friend in that abyss. After his death, silence wrapped around me tighter than chains. I realized then that prison doesn't just strip you of freedom, it strips you of witnesses to your life. One by one they vanish, until no one remembers you existed. Years later, I heard whispers of advancements outside, cell phones that fit in pockets, computers in every home, cars that drove smoother than dreams. The world was racing forward, and I was fossilized in the past. New inmates laughed at me when I asked simple questions, like a relic dug up from another era. Some guards didn't even know my case. To them, I was just another life awaiting to die behind bars. The press had forgotten me. Carolyn had moved on. My children were gone from my reach. I was a ghost wandering the halls, seen but not acknowledged. Some nights I'd sit by the barred window staring at a slice of sky. Stars blinked faintly through the haze, reminders of a freedom I could never touch. I whispered to myself, not prayers anymore, just fragments of memory. Jason's first bike ride. Sophia's first tooth. Carolyn's laugh. I repeated them like chants, afraid if I stopped they'd vanish completely. Forgotten by the world, yes, but I refused to forget them even if they had forgotten me. That stubbornness was the only rebellion I had left, the only proof that Anthony Walker still existed, beneath the number stitched on my chest. It was my 23rd year inside when a miracle cracked through the concrete of my life. By then I had stopped hoping. Appeals had failed. Lawyers had come and gone. Journalists had moved on to fresher tragedies. I was just another forgotten man rotting in a cell. Then one morning, Officer Daniel Ross, one of the younger guards, stopped at my door. Unlike Blake, Ross had a quiet dignity, a decency in his eyes. He slipped a folded paper through the bars. "Walker, you might want to look at this," he muttered. It was a copy of a legal notice. An attorney named Angela Price had filed a motion on my behalf. I didn't know her, didn't trust it at first. My name had been dangled before only to be crushed. But as I read the words, my hands shook. She claimed to have found evidence never presented to the jury, evidence that could prove my innocence. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if the air had turned to stone. Evidence after all these years? My mind spun with questions. What evidence? Where had it been? And why now, after decades of silence? Ross looked at me through the bars. She seems serious, Walker. Don't give up just yet. His voice carried no mockery, only a kind of rough compassion I hadn't felt from an officer in years. For the first time in forever, a spark flickered inside me, a dangerous, fragile thing called hope. A week later, Angela came to see me. She was younger than I expected, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp and alive with determination. She carried a stack of folders so thick it looked like she was dragging a mountain into the visiting room. When she sat across from me, there was no pity in her gaze, only fire. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice steady, "I believe you've spent 25 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. I found something in the archives, a police file that was never turned over to your defense." My stomach dropped. I gripped the table until my knuckles turned white. "What file?" I asked. She slid a photocopy toward me. My eyes scanned the page and my heart nearly burst. It was a witness statement. Another man had been seen near the alley the night Daniel Price was killed. A man who matched the description of a local known for violence. A statement buried, hidden from the jury. My throat tightened, my vision blurred. This piece of paper, this single forgotten document, was everything. Why didn't they use this? I whispered. Angela's jaw clenched. Because it didn't fit their story. The prosecutor never disclosed it. The detective buried it. But now it's ours. I sat there trembling, the sound of my pulse roaring in my ears. For the first time in decades, I felt the ground shift under me. Angela leaned forward. "This isn't going to be easy. They'll fight us. They'll call it too late, claim it changes nothing. But if you're willing, I'll fight with you." I looked at her, and in that moment, I saw the faintest crack in the walls that had buried me alive. That night, back in my cell, I held the photocopy in my hands like it was holy scripture. Red was gone, my mother was gone, Carolyn was gone, but here in my hands was proof. Proof I had been screaming for since day one. I whispered to myself over and over, "They lied. They hid this." The words tasted like both poison and freedom. I wanted to rage, to howl at the injustice, but more than anything, I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe Angela could pull me out of the grave I'd been thrown into. I taped the page to my wall above the fading drawing Sophia had once sent me. A reminder that truth still existed, buried though it was. But hope is a dangerous thing in prison. Men had killed themselves for less, clutching at false promises, waiting for appeals that never came. I knew that danger. Yet I couldn't help it. For the first time in decades, I lay on my bunk with my eyes open, not staring at the ceiling in despair, but imagining the world outside. Imagining Jason and Sophia, grown now, their faces blurred but alive. Imagining air that didn't reek of rust. Imagining freedom. That dusty file had blown the dust off me too, reminding me I was still a man, still Anthony Walker. And maybe, just maybe, the world would finally remember me. The road back to court was not paved with victory, but with endless obstacles. Angela warned me from the start. They'll fight us every step. No one in this system wants to admit they buried a man alive. And she was right. The first motion she filed was denied in less than a week. The judge wrote that the evidence was immaterial. Immaterial. That word echoed in my head as I sat on my bunk, staring at the photocopy taped to the wall. How could proof that another man had been seen at the crime scene be immaterial? Angela didn't give up. She filed again, gathering affidavits, digging through archives, unearthing every scrap of paper connected to my case. The guards mocked me, Blake sneering, "Dreaming of freedom, Walker? Don't waste your breath." But I didn't let him see me break. Angela's determination became the rope I held onto, pulling me inch by inch out of the pit. Weeks turned into months. Angela visited often, her folders growing thicker, her eyes more tired but never dimmed. She showed me reports of misconduct by Briggs, past cases where evidence had mysteriously vanished. She found experts who testified that Eric Johnson's statement was coerced, that his words were twisted by threats and pressure. Piece by piece she rebuilt the story. Not the lie they had told, but the truth I had lived. Still, every hearing was a battle. The prosecution argued I was desperate, clinging to scraps that nothing could undo a fair trial. Fair. That word felt like acid on my tongue. There had been nothing fair about any of it. The hardest part was patience. Each filing took weeks, each hearing months. Time, my enemy for decades, mocked me again. Nights stretched long as I waited for news. I'd sit at the small steel desk in my cell, writing letters to Jason and Sophia that I never knew if I'd send. I told them I still believed, that maybe one day they would hear the truth. Most of those letters stayed folded in my Bible, unsent, but writing them kept me alive. Red's voice haunted me in the silence. Don't let it kill you. Some nights I almost did let it. But then Angela's face would flash in my mind, her stubborn fire reminding me I wasn't done yet. In one hearing, Angela finally cornered Briggs on the stand. He was older now, his hair grey, but his smirk hadn't changed. She asked him directly why the witness statement had never been disclosed. He shifted in his seat, his voice defensive. I don't recall, he repeated over and over, the words dripping with practiced evasion. Angela's questions cut deeper each time, until the judge interrupted, sustaining the prosecution's objections. Still, I saw something in Briggs's eyes, a flicker of fear, the crack of a man who knew his lies were unraveling. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first time I felt the walls tremble. Years of silence turned into years of waiting, but slowly the tide shifted. Newspapers began to pick up Angela's filings, reporters sniffing at the scent of injustice. Erica Barnes, a journalist with a reputation for chasing hard truths, wrote an article titled "Buried Evidence: The Anthony Walker Case." For the first time since my conviction, my story made headlines not as a criminal, but as a man who might have been wronged. The article spread. Letters from strangers began arriving, people telling me to hold on, that they believed me. After decades of being forgotten, my name was back in the world. Finally, Angela called one afternoon with a tremor in her voice. Tony, the appellate court has agreed to review your case. We have a hearing date. I pressed the phone against my ear, my knees weak. 25 years of rot, of silence, of loss, and now maybe a chance. Fear twisted with hope in my chest. What if they crushed me again? What if they told me none of it mattered? But Angela's words steadied me. This is it, Tony. We've cracked the door open. Now we have to push it wide. That night I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, not in despair but in prayer. For the first time in decades, the future wasn't a dead end. It was a door, and maybe, just maybe, it was about to open. The morning of the hearing, my hands shook so hard I could barely button the collar of my faded prison shirt. After 25 years, this was my last shot, my final chance to prove the truth. Angela met me in the holding room before we entered court. Her eyes were steady, but I could see the exhaustion etched into her face. No matter what happens today, Tony, you need to know you didn't imagine it. They wronged you, and today we show it. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. When they led me into the courtroom, I scanned the benches. Strangers filled the gallery, reporters, students, people who'd read about my case. But not Jason, not Sophia, not Carolyn. That absence cut deeper than the shackles still on my wrists. Judge Whitman sat on the bench, older now, his hair thin and white. Time had softened his face, but not his authority. As the hearing began, Angela laid out the case piece by piece. She showed the jury what had been hidden, the witness statement, the misconduct, the lies. Erica Barnes sat in the back row scribbling notes, her eyes locked on every word. The prosecutor tried to dismiss it all as irrelevant, claiming the case was too old, the evidence too weak. But Angela's voice never faltered. This man has lost 25 years of his life because the truth was buried. Today you have the chance to dig it back up. Her words cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Then it happened. Judge Whitman leaned forward, his gavel resting silently beside him, and said the words I had waited a lifetime to hear. This court finds that the conviction of Anthony Walker cannot stand. The failure to disclose exculpatory evidence violated his right to a fair trial. Mr. Walker, you are hereby released. My knees nearly gave out. The room spun. I gripped the defense table, my breath ragged, tears burning hot down my face. I wanted to shout, to laugh, to collapse all at once. Instead, I just whispered, "Thank you." Angela squeezed my hand, her eyes glassy, her smile trembling. For a moment, the walls of prison I had carried inside me cracked, letting light pour through. The guards removed my chains. The click of the cuffs opening echoed louder than any gavel, louder than any verdict. My wrists were free, pale and scarred from years of steel biting into them. I looked down at my hands as though they belonged to a stranger. Around me, people clapped softly, some cheered, but it all felt distant, muffled. The sound that mattered was silence, the silence of a door finally opening after a lifetime sealed shut. They walked me outside, the air sharp and cold against my face. For the first time in 25 years, I breathed as a free man. The sky seemed impossibly wide, the colors too vivid, the world almost unreal. Reporters shouted my name, microphones thrust toward me, cameras flashing. "Mr. Walker, how does it feel? Do you have anything to say?" Their voices blurred together. I wanted to tell them it felt like stepping into another man's life. Like I had died in 1998 and come back in a world I didn't recognize. Instead, I just whispered, "It's not freedom if you can't give me back the years." But they didn't hear. They never really listened. Angela stood beside me, shielding me from the storm of cameras. "One step at a time, Tony," she said softly. And so I stepped, one foot on the pavement, then another until I was outside the courthouse gates. I looked up at the sky, wide and endless, and felt both full and hollow. I was free. But freedom tasted strange, like something spoiled by time. 25 years had been stolen from me, and no judge, no verdict, no open sky could ever give them back. When I walked out of the courthouse, the world was both familiar and unrecognizable. Cars looked sleeker, people stared at glowing phones, and billboards advertised things I couldn't understand. But the strangest change was the faces of the people I once loved. Jason agreed to meet me first. We sat across from each other in a diner, the smell of fried eggs and burnt coffee thick in the air. He was a man now, broad shoulders, streaks of grey at his temples. His hands looked like mine, scarred from years of labor. But his eyes, they carried a distance I couldn't cross. "Dad," he said softly, as if testing the word on his tongue. My throat closed up. I reached for him, but he pulled back slightly, like my touch was too heavy. "I don't know you anymore," he admitted, his voice cracking. The knife cut clean, deeper than prison ever had. I tried to tell him stories, about when he was 10, about his baseball games, and the time he broke the kitchen window with a soccer ball. He nodded politely, but I could tell the memories weren't his, they were mine. 25 years had built a wall between us, and words weren't enough to tear it down. When we parted, he shook my hand instead of hugging me. I walked out of that diner with my chest hollow, realizing freedom was lonelier than prison in ways I hadn't imagined. Sophia was harder. She agreed to see me weeks later, after Angela reached out to her. She stood in the doorway of her apartment, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. She was 6 when I left, a little girl who drew suns and flowers for me. Now she was a woman, hardened, protective of the life she built without me. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back after all this time?" I wanted to scream that I never left, that I was ripped away, that prison swallowed me whole, but all I could whisper was, "Because I never stopped being your father." She didn't answer, just let me inside reluctantly. Photos lined her walls, her with friends, her at college, her at work, none with me. We sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I tried to explain, to tell her I thought of her every night, that her drawings kept me alive. She listened but didn't look at me. Finally, she said, "I grew up without you. I learned not to need you. And now you're here, but I don't know what to do with that." Her words shattered me, but I nodded. I had no right to ask her for more. When I left, she didn't hug me either. She just closed the door gently, and that softness hurt more than anger ever could. Even Carolyn agreed to meet me once. She came with her new husband, sitting stiffly across from me at a cafe. Her hair was streaked with silver now, her eyes older but still familiar. She spoke kindly but cautiously, as if I were a stranger who might break at any moment. "I'm glad you're free, Tony," she said, her hand resting on her husband's. "But the past is gone. You need to find a new life." I wanted to argue, to tell her I had spent 25 years fighting for the one we lost. But I swallowed the words. She had moved on. They all had. Walking home from those meetings, I stared at the faces on the street. Everyone seemed in motion, rushing somewhere, living lives I couldn't touch. I was free, yes, but untethered. The people I loved most were alive yet unreachable, changed by time into strangers. And I was left with a question I couldn't shake. What do you do when freedom gives you back the world, but not the people you fought for? The silence that followed was its own kind of prison, and I carried it with me everywhere I went. Freedom wasn't a sunrise. It was a shadow. I walked the streets of Pittsburgh with nothing but a box of prison-issue clothes and a bus ticket Angela had pressed into my hand. The city was louder, faster, brighter than I remembered. People brushed past me, eyes glued to glowing screens, and I felt invisible among them. Every sound startled me. The hiss of brakes, the bark of a dog, the chatter of strangers. I had dreamed of this moment for 25 years, yet standing there I felt like a ghost wandering through someone else's world. They said I was free, but I didn't know what that meant anymore. Free to do what? Free to go where? The years had been stolen, and all I had left was time I no longer knew how to use. At night I lay awake in a small room provided by a re-entry program. The mattress was soft, the sheets clean, but I couldn't sleep. Silence pressed in on me heavier than prison noise ever had. I thought of Jason shaking my hand instead of hugging me. I thought of Sophia closing her door gently in my face. I thought of Carolyn's voice, kind but final, telling me to move on. The family I fought for was alive but lost to me. The system had freed my body, but left my soul caged in grief. Angela kept visiting, urging me to consider speaking publicly, telling my story. "It can change things, Tony," she said. "It can stop this from happening again." Erica Barnes offered the same, promising to write more articles, to keep the light shining on my case. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to think my pain could serve a purpose. But every time I tried to speak, the words died in my throat. What could I tell the world? That justice came too late. That no victory could restore what had been ripped away. People wanted a story of triumph, of redemption. But all I had was loss. Sometimes I wandered past the old neighborhood. The house where Carolyn and I once lived was painted a new color. Children's toys scattered across the lawn. A different family laughed inside, a family untouched by the nightmare that had destroyed mine. I stood on the sidewalk watching, remembering Jason kicking a soccer ball, Sophia drawing with chalk on the driveway, Carolyn waving from the porch. Then I turned away. That life wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the past. A past buried deeper than any prison cell. I often sit on park benches now, watching strangers hurry by. No one knows my name, no one knows my story, and maybe that's for the best. But sometimes I whisper it to myself, a reminder that I existed, that I fought, that I survived. I am Anthony Walker, and I spent 25 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. They finally read the evidence, finally admitted the truth, but too late to give me back the man I used to be. Too late to give me back my children, my wife, my mother, my life. And yet, here I am, breathing, walking, telling myself that survival, even empty-handed, is still something. Maybe my legacy isn't joy or triumph, but warning, that truth buried is truth denied, and men can vanish into cages because of it. The world keeps moving, and I move with it, carrying the weight of years I'll never reclaim. Freedom came, yes, but hollow. And in that hollow space, I live, I remember, and I endure. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.